At 3:17 a.m. Eastern Time this morning, a decision quietly signed inside the White House triggered what insiders are calling the most dangerous fracture in the Western alliance in decades. The United States abruptly froze all intelligence sharing with Canada inside the Five Eyes network, a move that security officials say could instantly destabilize North American defense coordination. Within just 4 hours, emergency calls erupted between Washington, Ottawa, and NATO headquarters in Brussels as analysts realized the scale of the shock. A $935 billion economic corridor between the United States and Canada could begin freezing within days if the crisis escalates. But here's what's truly alarming. While this rupture unfolds in real time, mainstream networks are still cautiously labeling it a policy dispute. Subscribe now, because by the time traditional media catches up to what is really happening, the geopolitical damage may already be irreversible. In the next 12 minutes, we're going to break down 3 critical realities that mainstream coverage is barely touching. First, the hidden trigger behind Washington's sudden decision to cut intelligence ties with Ottawa. Second, the economic shockwave that could destabilize a $935 billion North American trade artery faster than most analysts predicted. And third, the most dangerous possibility of all, the 3 scenarios that could unfold if the 48-hour diplomatic deadline expires. Stay with me, because the final scenario at the end of this video may explain why global leaders are suddenly preparing for the worst. To understand why this crisis escalated so suddenly, we need to step back and examine 4 pieces of evidence that are quietly reshaping the entire narrative. Because what appears on the surface as a diplomatic dispute is, according to several defense analysts, a structural fracture inside the Western alliance system itself. Let's start with the first piece of evidence. Evidence 1. The intelligence freeze that should never happen. The Five Eyes alliance, formed by the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, is often described by intelligence professionals as the most integrated intelligence network in human history. Data flows between these countries in real time. Signals intelligence, satellite tracking, cyber threat detection, counter-terror surveillance, all of it moves through shared systems that were built over decades. That is precisely why the sudden decision by Washington to freeze intelligence transfers, specifically with Canada, shocked analysts around the world. Because historically, Five Eyes partners do not cut each other off unless something extremely serious has occurred. Former U.S. National Security Council advisor Dr. Fiona Hill once described the alliance in a public forum by saying, "Breaking intelligence trust between Five Eyes members would represent a strategic earthquake." And yet, at 3:17 a.m., that earthquake may have begun. According to multiple security sources, the concern in Washington centers around a classified technology program known internally as Northern Shield AI. If the reports are accurate, the United States believes sensitive data from American quantum computing research may have been exposed through Canadian industrial partnerships. If true, that would mean advanced defense algorithms capable of predicting cyber attacks or missile trajectories could potentially enter global commercial markets. And that is something the Pentagon has historically treated as a red line. Evidence 2. The $935 billion economic pressure point. But intelligence alone does not explain the scale of the response. The second layer of this crisis sits in economic leverage. Every year, the United States and Canada move roughly $935 billion in goods, energy, and industrial supply chains across their shared border. It is the largest bilateral trading relationship on the planet. Pipelines move oil and natural gas south. Automotive factories send parts back and forth across the border multiple times during production. Agricultural shipments travel in both directions every day. In other words, the US-Canada border is not simply a political boundary, it is an economic circulatory system. Now imagine what happens if Washington begins imposing aggressive tariffs or trade restrictions as part of the intelligence dispute. Even a 10% disruption in cross-border logistics could ripple through North American manufacturing in weeks. And that is why some economists are already sounding alarms. During a financial conference earlier this year, Warren Buffett warned that global markets underestimate how fragile modern supply chains can be. His words were direct. Economic systems don't break slowly. When pressure builds in the wrong place, they snap. That warning now appears eerily relevant because the US-Canada supply chain is exactly the kind of interconnected system Buffett was describing. If the current dispute escalates, it would not simply affect two countries, it would shake the entire North American economic platform. Evidence 3. NATO's quiet concern. While headlines focus on Washington and Ottawa, another institution is watching the situation very closely: NATO, and for good reason. Both the United States and Canada are founding members of the alliance, and their militaries operate together constantly. Joint Arctic patrols, air defense coordination, naval exercises in the Atlantic. If intelligence sharing between the two countries becomes restricted, it introduces something extremely dangerous into NATO planning: information gaps. Former NATO Supreme Allied Commander Admiral James Stavridis once explained why those gaps matter. He said that in modern security environments, information delays can be more dangerous than military weaknesses because they create uncertainty, and uncertainty forces commanders to slow down decisions. If the Five Eyes fracture spreads into broader intelligence limitations, NATO planners could suddenly face a situation where two key allies are operating with different intelligence pictures. In strategic terms, that would be unprecedented. Evidence 4. The political clock is ticking. But the most critical factor may be time. According to diplomatic sources, Washington has reportedly delivered a 48-hour window for clarification regarding the disputed technology program. Deadlines in diplomacy are never random. They are pressure tools. The idea is simple: compress the timeline so the other side must respond quickly and visibly. And that puts enormous pressure on Canada's leadership. Prime Minister Mark Carney now faces an extremely difficult calculation. If Ottawa fully complies with Washington's demands, it risks appearing politically weak at home. But if it refuses or delays, the United States could escalate with economic or intelligence retaliation. This is where crises often become unpredictable, because once governments begin making decisions under time pressure, rational diplomacy can quickly give way to strategic escalation. At this point, the pattern becomes clear: a sudden intelligence freeze, a $935 billion economic corridor under threat, NATO quietly monitoring the situation, and a diplomatic deadline ticking down in the background. These are not isolated developments. They are interlocking pressure points. And when multiple pressure points align inside international politics, the system can move very quickly from tension to confrontation. If you're beginning to see how serious this situation could become, hit the like button right now, because the next part of this analysis may be the most important. What happens when that 48-hour deadline actually expires? Because when it does, the world could face three very different futures, and only one of them leads to stability. The most critical question now is simple: what happens when the 48-hour diplomatic clock reaches zero? When crises like this unfold, governments typically face three possible strategic paths. None of them are easy, and each one carries consequences that could reshape the North American alliance. Let's examine them one by one. Scenario 1. Full de-escalation. In the first scenario, Canada decides to move quickly to restore trust with Washington. That could mean temporarily suspending the Northern Shield AI program, opening the project to a joint US-Canadian security review, and allowing American intelligence agencies to verify that sensitive technologies were not transferred outside secure channels. Diplomatically, this would be the fastest way to stabilize the situation. Intelligence sharing inside Five Eyes would likely resume within days, and financial markets would interpret the move as a signal that the crisis has been contained. However, this scenario carries political risks for Ottawa. Agreeing to Washington's demands too quickly could create the perception that Canada was forced into compliance under pressure, something domestic political opponents would immediately exploit. In other words, stability internationally might come at the cost of political turbulence at home. Scenario 2. Partial compliance. The second scenario is far more complicated. Canada could attempt a middle path, offering transparency and negotiations while refusing to shut down the technology program entirely. In this situation, intelligence cooperation might resume only partially. Some data channels could reopen, while others remain restricted until additional investigations are completed. Economically, this approach could prevent the worst-case trade disruptions, but it would also introduce long-term uncertainty. Investors hate uncertainty. Defense planners hate it even more. If the US and Canada begin operating under partially restored intelligence systems, it could create a lingering sense that the alliance is no longer as seamless as it once was. And once doubt enters an alliance structure, it can take years to remove. Scenario 3. Strategic rupture. The final scenario is the one security experts fear most. If the diplomatic window closes without agreement, Washington could escalate. That escalation might include sweeping economic tariffs, expanded technology restrictions, or a prolonged intelligence freeze. At that point, the crisis would no longer be limited to diplomacy. It would become a structural fracture between two of the closest allies in modern history. Markets would likely react first. Supply chains could begin slowing within weeks. Energy flows across the border could face new regulatory pressure. And the ripple effects would move far beyond North America. Because when the core of the Western alliance shows signs of division, other global powers pay attention. They watch, they calculate, and they look for opportunities. That is why the next few hours may be far more important than they appear on the surface. This is not just a dispute between neighbors. It could be a defining test of how resilient Western alliances really are under pressure. Right now, the clock is still ticking. Somewhere inside government offices in Washington and Ottawa, diplomats, security officials, and economic advisors are racing against a 48-hour deadline that could redefine one of the closest alliances in modern history. What began at 03:17 a.m. as a quiet intelligence decision may now be pushing the United States and Canada toward a moment that could reshape the balance of trust inside the Western world. Because once intelligence alliances fracture, rebuilding them is never simple. And if the economic pressure that analysts fear actually begins to spread, the consequences could extend far beyond North America. So the real question is this: has Washington pushed too far, or has Ottawa underestimated the stakes of this crisis? Tell me what you think in the comments. I read every perspective. And subscribe so you don't miss the next update, because this story is far from over.